So, my dear participants, we are really very happy to have Professor Jessica Frazier with us. Professor Frazier teaches theology and religion at Trinity College, Oxford. She is also a fellow of Center for Hindu Studies at Oxford, and she has many important publications to her credit. And she specializes on Vedantic metaphysics, hermeneutics, and comparative global philosophy. So, without wasting any more time, let us invite Professor Fraser for your presentation. Professor Fraser, please.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for the chance to speak. And it's very nice to kind of meet everyone at a distance. I have to make one apology before I start, which is this, and I sent an email as certain, so you also have to tell me if you cannot hear me. Ooh, this is frozen, so I don't know if you can hear me, but I'll keep talking for a moment until I hear. I will have to leave in an hour.
That's fine.
Because an emergency meeting has come up. Okay, brilliant. So I'll continue. And your screen is frozen to me, but if you can't hear me at some point, then just stop me and say. Otherwise, I'll keep talking.
Okay, great.
Okay, perfect, great. So what I'm going to do essentially is, I don't know what everyone here in the group is studying, and so apologies if I tell you things you already know. And I don't know whether people are necessarily working primarily on history or on philosophy or on other matters. But what I'm going to speak primarily about is philosophical questions, because that's become my own interest recently. And Oxford has just started in the last few years its first course devoted to philosophy, Indian philosophy, in the philosophy faculty. And this has been a big thing in a way, partly because while there have been many great scholars of Indian philosophy in Oxford for a long time, like the Mamatulal, nevertheless, it was being treated merely as history. And now we're kind of looking at it as philosophy, as ideas that are maybe ideas we should be taking up now in the modern world as our own way of thinking about life. So I'm going to look at the material not primarily historical, but really as a perspective that's of interest philosophically. So what I'll do is I'll dive in, and I'm going to share screen. And again, I don't know how much you do or don't know, but I'm going to talk about India's perhaps three most prominent forms of idealism. And that will be Advaita, associated largely with Shankara. It will be also Pratyabhijna, also known as Kashmir Shaivism, associated most prominently with Abhinavagupta, but of course many others. And it will be Yogacara, the Buddhist school, which offers a very radically different idealism, which is associated with a number of figures, Dharmakirti, Dignaga, and others. And I just want to kind of set out the different perspectives on what an idealism can be, touch upon the differences, and in a way I want to offer them to you as a question about which one makes philosophically the most sense as a functioning, coherent system. And as we'll see, each of them raises certain philosophical questions, I think, that were not solved in the 800s and were not solved in the 1000s, as it were, and were still very much alive in the early modern period, in the 1500s, 1600s, when India has continued debating these things, as has European philosophy. So we are, in a sense, at the culmination of that history. We're still in the middle of it, and it's still our job to try and resolve these problems. So I will try and leave you with some of the questions that I think remain unresolved in those Indian idealist systems. And hopefully, even if I do have to leave early, you all can solve the problems in discussion, and then you can tell me, and then we'll be able to, the whole of history can rejoice. So I'm going to share my screen to show a PowerPoint, if that's all right. So let me do this. Share. She presses this button. Great. Now that should show you my file folder, and I'm just opening the relevant ones. So, Varieties of Idealism. Wait for that to open. Gradually. Perfect. I'll just close a few things in order to keep this happening. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Make sure that my computer can deal with everything. Okay. Slideshow from beginning. Okay, super. So, close this over here. Varieties of Idealism, and let me turn off the subtitles if I can. There we go. Varieties of Idealism. And I want to look at this from the perspective that many cultures, certainly those cultures which have developed long, vibrant philosophical traditions, that's India, China, and Europe at least, probably others as well, they have all developed idealistic ways of thinking about the world. And then they've had to debate whether or not that's correct. And of course, idealism is always an interesting and controversial perspective in some ways, because it can appear very natural to think that the pen is, and obviously it's a solid external thing. And so idealisms often arrive and appear on the kind of public scene of consciousness as something very curious, something paradoxical, something challenging in certain ways. So in a way, idealisms are always the outsider philosophy. India is interesting because whereas, for instance, Europe, arguably Plato has elements of idealism in him, but really fully idealist systems don't develop in the West until quite late in its history, until arguably 2000, certainly almost 1,000 years after India. So India has this much longer history of idealism than pretty much any culture in the world. And of course, because India also didn't have the kind of structures of like exclusive doctrinal orthodoxy that existed in a lot of other cultures, certainly in European cultures under Christianity, for instance, new ideas didn't get shut down. So that sense of rich alternative possibilities arising is really important for the way that the Indian conceptions became so prolific, so diverse in their ways of thinking. So again, you may already be studying these, if you may know nothing about them, I don't know. So I'll sort of start from the beginning a little bit, but I'm focusing on 3 schools of idealism, and looking at it from the perspective that underneath, this is a debate over the nature of thought itself. And as we'll see from an early stage, India is really interested to think about the nature of thought. Not only is idealism a way of thinking that develops much later in Europe, but also what in philosophy is called phenomenology. Phenomenology effectively being the analysis of the structure, the nature, the contents of our experience. And phenomenology, which is almost like a science of how we experience things. Again, arguably there are hints of it in Plato, there are hints of it in Hegel, but essentially it doesn't really get going until, let's say, the 1800s in Europe. Arguably, in India, it's already starting with the Yoga Sutras and before, because India has this extraordinary, pretty much almost unique history through the beginnings of early yogic, and here we really mean meditation traditions, of people doing the hard work of sitting and reflecting inward. So what René Descartes does in his meditations in the West happens again almost 2,000 years earlier in India. So what does this debate over the nature of thought show? Well, we have this idea of consciousness being something that everything is made of, but in Advaita Vedanta, I'm thinking here of Shankara, it's seen as separate from mind, so that it's an idealism of consciousness, pure awareness, but not an idealism necessarily in quite the same way of mental, conceptual ideas. So that for Advaita, where basically we as individual beings are mere misunderstandings of what consciousness really is. It's a very striking doctrine, different from many others because of this cognitive illusory element of the everyday empirical world that we see around us. Different from that, and we'll come back to each of these in turn, is Pratyabhijna, the school associated with Kashmiri Shaivism and people like Abhinav Gupta, where consciousness is itself the medium of all we see. It's not something under the perceived empirical world, it's the stuff that it's made of. So that consciousness is the wider medium, almost like an ocean. And each of these things, our own minds, the objects we see, are almost like currents within that wider ocean. So we are kind of sub-minds within the big mind that all reality is, where that big mind is identified for this school as Shiva. But you also get a third school, perhaps less widely known. It's a Buddhist school of idealism called Yogacara, where consciousness is not an eternal underlying reality, nor is it the ocean of reality within which we exist. It's a kind of flow of moments, and mind is the pattern that they take, but there's no real person there. With Yogacara, we're sort of structure in the cloud of ideas that exist, with no real self being there at all. So what does this look like? Well, I kind of want to talk a little bit to what the origins of this are historically, in terms of classical India and its development of ideas about the mind. If we look at early Vedanta, and here I'm thinking of the Upanishads, we'll look at some shortly, it develops an interest in the idea of the permanent self, of course, and this is the Atman. We see it explored again and again throughout the many different Upanishads, ranging from something like 900 BC all the way up to, 200 BC or something. So from the late Vedic core literature period to after Buddhism. And the ideas of Atman are diverse, so that if you look at the Brihadaranyaka and the Mandukya Upanishads, Atman is seen as something to do with going inward into consciousness. Whereas if you look at things like the Chandogya Upanishad or others more like that, Atman seems to be more about the divine material that everything is made out of. It's less internal and more external. And if you look at texts like the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, you have a much more theistic perspective. So there's diversity within these different texts. So here we have a notion of the Atman based on looking at interior experience, an understanding of what causes all of our experiences as well. So they have philosophically an interest in causation. What's the source? What's the impelling force that makes things happen? And also a real fascination with permanence as opposed to impermanence. Already, of course, and Buddhism picks up this theme later, there's a sense that most of our thoughts, most of our personality changes, and there's a deep concern to identify what's permanent. And for those inclined towards idealism, what's permanent is the consciousness itself. And within this, the self can kind of become created, as it were, as an individual personality. But of course, partly because of the doctrine of punarjanma, of rebirth, of samsara, you never overcommit to the mind and the personality, because the mind and the personality will pass. So Vedanta always also encourages a sense of looking beneath the top layer of mind that I think Descartes was kind of fascinated with. He just wanted to understand what the thoughts are doing. But Vedanta wants to go a bit deeper and say, what is it that does not change? What is it that creates the self but is not itself created? Samkhya adds to this, so this other school of philosophy that existed in the early phase of Indian thought, and develops this more dualistic way of thinking about reality. So you've got Purusha, which is pure awareness, and Prakriti, which is, particularly if you look at the text, it's not just matter, it's not a mind-matter dualism, as with Descartes, because Prakriti includes thoughts, it includes ego, right? So actually it's more like a consciousness and contents of consciousness distinction. And there's quite a good book by Mikkel Burley on Samkhya, where he says Samkhya is, again, almost like reading Husserl or Heidegger. It does a careful analysis of what pure consciousness is, and then a pure analysis of what we call the intentional contents of consciousness as two separate things. And it reminds you to push away the thoughts, the personality, the sensations, the temporary bits, and look for that pure level underneath. In a sense, because Samkhya is quite dualistic, it's going to encourage Vedanta to develop a more dualistic way of seeing the mind. It's actually hugely influential, as we'll see on Advaita, on Shankara. But not to forget the Buddhists. Also in Abhidharma Buddhism, you've got to kind of deconstruct this conception of self that says, well, actually, there's just fleeting experiences. The momentary qualia, as Thomas Nagel would call them, just the pure, light, dark, sound, sensation. But they flow, they change. And you can deconstruct all these different bits. I can deconstruct my sense of self, mind, memory, etc., and take them apart until there's nothing left. So this kind of almost like a Lego sort of building blocks that put together and can be taken apart is very different from Samkhya's view and from Vedantic views. So we already have a pluralistic setup even before the serious idealistic philosophies get going. Now, in Western idealism, just to take a step, just to compare and think about how different idealisms play out, again, you've got different sources. You've got Plato helping people think about numbers and concepts as real in themselves. And he is interested in the soul, also believes in rebirth. But he doesn't quite develop these into an idealist way of looking at the world as fundamentally in the mind or of the mind. There's also Descartes, of course, who is the first person to say, I can't really know that there is an external world out there. But in the end, famously, he says, oh, but there must be one. And he says, there must be because God wouldn't be so mean as to trick me and have me live in the matrix, in some invisible, some unreal world. And later, this is exactly what people like Immanuel Kant think, oh, that wasn't very good reason. Just use God to fill the gap, but it wasn't a fully rational account. You start to get more idealist ideas with people like Hegel in the German tradition, who says everything is made of spirit, that unfolds and unpacks. And Hegel, in some ways, is quite similar to Kashmiri or Pratyabhijnana in India. And Hegel, I think, is influential on people later who take up all these ideas, like, for instance, Sri Aurobindo. So lots of people in the 1800s, 1900s who will have studied Hegel see the connections with Indian thought and do interesting things with that. You also, in England, you eventually get these full-scale idealists like Berkeley, who take Descartes' skepticism and make it stronger. And eventually this also leads to, in Germany, if you like, the most radical forms of idealism, with people like Heidegger who seem to be saying, we don't even know that there's a self. We don't even know that there's an outside world. All we have is the experience, right? So he's closer to someone like Kashmiri Shaivism, or maybe even to Yogacara Buddhism. We don't even know that the self is there, but we do have the experience, and we can deal with that just by itself. So there's a whole history of the West, but none of them are quite as clearly developed as the Indian versions are. And there's a number of sources that lead into the Indian versions, just in terms of thinking about what material they're using. This is from the Chandogya Upanishad, which is a wonderful, short, accessible text. And it, I think, begins with this little verse here. By whom impelled, by whom compelled, does the mind soar forth? By whom enjoined does the breath march on as the first? By whom is this speech impelled with which people speak? So all of this is asking, where does my thought come from? Where does my breath come from? Where's my speech? What's causing it to happen? This is really interesting in itself already. A lot of cultures are only looking at causation, what leads things to happen in terms of the outside world. But here we have a very, very early Indian text, came as probably like 500 BC-ish, but it's saying, no, we should be thinking about internal causation. Right? What are the laws and forces happening within? And then it goes on and it points to something in philosophy called the unity of apperception. Right? How is it that different night and tell us the same thing? So who is the God that joins the sight and the hearing? And God here could also just mean natural force. That which is the hearing behind hearing, the thinking behind thinking, the speech behind speech, the sight behind sight, that is the self, it says. Right? Even though it's concerned about how you can even understand it, if it's the source of thought, then thinking will always kind of be the thing it makes rather than the thing causing it. You see what I mean? So it says, we don't know, we can't perceive how one would point it out. But it does look inward, think about the nature of thought, ask about where it comes from, and notice that our different senses and thoughts kind of go together in some curious, unified way. I won't read all of this, but it's from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the oldest Upanishad, and probably the one from which maybe it's the earliest source of all idealist thought in India, arguably. There's a famous bit, there's a famous image that also turns up in the Chandogya Upanishad, chapter 6, which is very famous and influential in Vedanta, of salt being thrown into water. But this uses it as an image of perception, of consciousness, as being like a bowl of pure water with ideas in it. It says it's like this: when a chunk of salt is thrown in water, it dissolves into that very water, and it cannot be picked up in any way. Yet from whichever place one may take a sip, the salt is there. That same analogy is used in the Chandogya Upanishad for Brahman. But there it's more like Brahman in nature. Here it's Brahman in mind. So it goes on and says, in the same way, this immense being has no limit or boundary and is a single mass of perception. It's really interested in this idea that if you look within, you can see perception happening. And it's not made of bits, it's a single mass. And Yajnavalkya says after death, that means that after death there's no awareness. And his wife Maitreyi says, that's very odd. Why is there no awareness? That doesn't make any sense. And he goes on and he says, well, if all reality is a mass of perception, you wouldn't be aware of anything, because if you look at the bottom in red, when, however, the whole has become one's very self, then who is there for one to smell, and by what means? Who is there for one to see, and by what means? By what means can one perceive him who, by means of whom one perceives this whole world? So look, by what means can one perceive the perceiver? And the idea is that if all reality is consciousness, then in a way, everything is inside of it. We are the whole of all of this all at once. We're not really perceiving some separate external thing. So this becomes hugely influential. And arguably the earliest Upanishad, Brihadaranyaka, is very influential on, and directly quoted by, arguably the latest Upanishad of the main kind of cluster, which would be the Mandukya Upanishad, which has a very crypt, it's very short. Brihadaranyaka is the longest, the Mandukya is the shortest. But the Mandukya packs a lot in and is the main source that inspires Gaudapada, is the earliest Advaitic thinker, Shankara, who's his pupil, and the whole tradition of Advaita. So it talks about consciousness in this way. The first quarter is Vaishvanara, from Vishva in Sanskrit, the universal, and it's situated in the waking state, perceiving what is outside of our minds, and enjoying gross here means physical things. The second quarter of consciousness is Taijasa, from Tejas in Sanskrit, the brilliant one. It's situated in the state of dream, so it's talking about dream imagination, and it perceives what is inside. And it enjoys refined things, which here means non-physical. The third quarter is Prajna, the intelligent one, situated in the state of deep sleep, where there are no desires or dreams. So it has this idea of consciousness without contents, without thoughts, pure and in itself. So that in this, we have a very different picture. This idea of this, in this awareness, we become one, and consciousness becomes a single mass of perception. That's it, quoting the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad text we saw a moment ago, and this is at least 500 years later. Here, we become a single mass of perception consisting of bliss and enjoying bliss, having thought as the mouth we experience. No senses are in action. Thought is what perceives things. It's the Lord of all, the knower of all, the inner controller, the womb of all, the origin and dissolution of all beings, but where beings here are seen as conceptual rather than physical. And famously, there's a very mysterious fourth part of consciousness, which is very different indeed. It has no distinguishing marks. It's unperceiving, unperceivable, ungraspable, and completely different and mysterious, which is sometimes then associated with God. I'll rush through in a way. Samkhya also gives us, again, as I said, these ideas of pure Purusha, pure consciousness, and Prakriti, which is very different from that, right? So this is just from a part of the Samkhya Karaka, which talks about the difference between the aggregated, combining, multifaceted, qualified world of perceptions and the pure consciousness that is the witness or enjoyer of them. It says there should be a duality. And just notice from that where the Brihadaranyaka and the Chandogya Upanishads talked about a single mass of perception, here we've got the Samkhya Karaka talking about the perceptions and the seer as two different things. A bit maybe like the Kena Upanishad when it says there's the thoughts, but then the source of the thoughts. So we almost have two different models already. A single mass like an ocean, or two parts with the seer and the seen parts as separate. Now, to go through what develops out of this in the medieval period, so we're talking about something like 500 CE through to about 1100, we get much more developed philosophical positions. One is Yogacara Buddhism. And I'll set out each of these philosophies in turn. And what you can do perhaps is think about which one you think makes most sense. It's kind of interesting to get involved in the philosophy by trying to figure out which one in the end you would choose, right? So Yogacara Buddhism is quite controversial. It says, in Abhidharma, the earlier form, we can analyze different parts of oneself. There's the ego, there's the mind, there's the perceptions, there's memory and imagination, and there's the physical body. And what happens is the Yogacara Buddhism thinks about this, and using what in philosophy is sometimes called Occam's razor, the idea that you should get rid of any ideas you don't need in your system. And you say, well, wait a second, all I know of my body is through the ego, the mind, the senses. All I know of the outside world is through the ego, the mind, the senses, memory. So actually, I only know those things. I don't need body or outside world. And they get rid of the external world. They get rid of the physical world and of the body. So they say the parts of the self are all perceived, but we don't need the bodily, physical, external parts. There is only ego, mind, memory, and the senses, but no body. And we should therefore get rid of the very concept of a body and of a physical and of an external world. Why? Because of what's called the principle of lightness. Again, Occam's razor, get rid of anything that you simply don't need in your system. There's no reason to believe it's even there. Objections were made to this idea. One, if that's the case, if there's no physical world and just the inner world, how is it that everything kind of seems to fit together in a coherent way? If it's just perceptions floating along, moment by moment, a stream of separate perceptions, why do they all stick together so that this appears to be my hand? And even when I move it or put it over here, it still seems to be my hand. How does that structural coherence arise if it's just a flow of perception? And why is it that different people can seem to experience the same thing? Hopefully, if you're listening there on the other side of the screen, then you're all hearing the same words at the same time. But how is that possible if there's no central mind or body or reality keeping it all together? And so too, how is it even arising? Right? Why does it have any power, causal efficacy? And if all of this is in my mind, why can't I just will my hand to turn into a dove and fly away? Let me try. I just tried, but it didn't happen. Right? So why is there a kind of autonomous structure to the mental world if it's all merely in my mind? And where do these ideas come from? What are the sources of these ideas, of a hand or even of a dove, if there's no external world that I got the ideas from in the first place? So all of this was problematic for these guys. How does it all fit together? Why does it have its own structure? Nevertheless, Yogacara thought that ultimately it's just different moments of experience flowing along like a river, none of them really connected. And even the notion of a self having the experience is really just part of the flow of the river. Right, so the idea of a self is a kind of non-real epiphenomenon, as it were. It's not something that's really there at all. It's like, I don't know, an image on the movie screen. You know, you think that the frames of the film come up one after another, they're all different. And yet I think that there's a person walking across the screen. But in fact, there's no real continuity there. It was just changing different images. So for Buddhism, you have idealism, but with no self. That's model one. That was the most controversial, but most radically skeptical Buddhist idealist model. Experience, but no self. More well known, of course, is Advaita Vedanta, and it becomes hugely influential in India. It holds that everything is finite and changeful that we experience, and so that all experience is not ultimate. It's not the ultimate truth, right? It's what's called vyavaharika truth. It's intermediate truth. Only consciousness itself is unchanging and universal everywhere. Plus, it's very different in kind. Consciousness is luminous, unchanging, pure. Ideas and shapes and forms are constantly finite and shifting. So Advaita kind of follows Samkhya and says there are two different realities. One, the contents of consciousness. One is the consciousness itself. And so perceptions are not real, but only they're kind of superimposed adhyasa, like a snake on a rope. The famous image is that if you're walking through the forest and you see a rope on the ground, I've done this myself, you think it's a snake and you go, oh my gosh. And then you realize it's a rope and the snake disappears. The snake never existed at all. If someone said, oh, where did the snake go? You'd say, oh, no, it didn't exist. So it really is a fully illusory account of the empirical world. Again, there are objections to this. And the main one that even other Vedantics thinkers raised was what causes this illusion? Is it Brahman, the one consciousness that causes the illusion, almost as if it was dreaming it? Well, that seems very odd if Brahman is supposed to be unchanging, inactive, pure. Does it arise all by itself? Well, then it has great power of its own. Then you have a real dualism where the illusion, which generates everything, is almost as strong and powerful and important as the pure consciousness. So there were big issues that were raised there. Later Vedantic thinkers like Ramanuja complained that actually Advaita had a problem with explaining how the illusory world is caused. And because of that part, the Advaita actually split into two different schools, the Bhamati and the Vivarana branches, one of which thought that there really is a second reality apart from consciousness. And it's your ego, the jiva, that generates ignorance, right? So it's not consciousness in its pure state that generates the world we live in. It's not any other being. It's almost the ego that generates reality. The problem is the ego is part of the illusion, right? So it's an illusion that generates the illusion. And people who are unhappy about Advaita said, well, yeah, but how did the ego start things off if it's an illusion? He said, oh, well, that is part of a prior illusion. Kind of the karmas created. But where do the karmas come from? Well, karmas are created because of the actions of an ego. But how did the ego arise? Well, because of karmas. So opponents said this created a regress, right? A paradox. And as a result, the Vivarana school tried to kind of bat that back and said, we don't even have to explain why the illusion happens because it's non-existent. But others said, yeah, but that's not quite right, because if I have a dream, I said, oh, I dreamt a huge dragon. And then someone says, oh, so where did the dragon go? What happened to the dragon? How did the dragon come? You say, no, the dragon didn't exist. But the dream of the dragon did exist, right? So I still have to explain why the illusion arose, even if there wasn't a real dragon there. So too, I have to explain why reality happens, even if it's not real. So Advaita, in some ways, is the most extraordinary model. It has this pure, eternal, unchanging awareness. And then it has the second reality of illusory existence. But in this early classical form, it also had lots of philosophical questions to answer. Finally, Pratyabhijna, school of Shaivism, said that everything is finite, everything is changeful, consciousness is universal and unchanging. So they said, yes, we agree that A, with Yogacara, there's no reason to believe in an external world. Anything external is unimaginable. It could have no connection with the perceptual world. But if everything is perception, there is a difference between the things I perceive and the person perceiving them. So they agreed that everything is consciousness, but that there are two different levels, if you like, the perceiver and the perceived. And so we have a model where everything is indeed in consciousness. But unlike Shankara, they felt that the I don't say illusory world, the perceived world has to arise out of the fundamental consciousness that perceives them. So they said it is a cause. The ultimate consciousness causes, does indeed dream or imagine up this wonderful, strange, complex world we're in. So they disagreed with Advaita on their dualism. They said it is the case that consciousness creates the world. They also disagreed with Yogacara because they said there has to be a person, there has to be a mind that creates it all. So there really is a self out there. But of course, what Pratyabhijna did, a bit like Berkeley's subjective idealism, they said that ultimately the one mind that generates everything, so that each of us is an idea of that one mind, is Shiva for them, which it defined as one great, all-unifying consciousness. And they said consciousness both illuminates all the things of the world, prakasha. It also conceptualizes them into beings and situations and stories, time and space, vimarsha. It's the one consciousness that sets everything going, spanda, in this kind of complex world. And it also says if Shiva wants, if the one mind wants, it can reabsorb everything again. Now, in some ways, people said, oh, but this doesn't make sense. So Shiva imagines the world into being. And they said, oh, that's how we think about it. And they said, well, that means Shiva is active. He creates this complex world. And they said, yes, Shiva is highly creative, where for Advaita, the ultimate reality is unchanging. For Pratyabhijna, the ultimate reality is creative and energetic. I always think of that when you see statues of Shiva Nataraja dancing. It links very well with this philosophy. The divine is not pure and still, the divine is active and engaged. Right? And just if we think of it not religiously, but just as philosophy, it acknowledges that for consciousness to be true, for idealism to be true, it has to be active and busy, if you like. And so we get these nice images from Pratyabhijna. Abhinavagupta says that single principle which is within and external to things, whose form is radiance, unlimited enlightened darkness. That is the divinity that is the essence of all beings. And its sovereign Shakti, its power or energy, produces all entities. And in Upaladeva's classic work, the Ishvara Pratyabhijna Karika, he says the reflexive awareness I, the perceiver, whose nature is the light of consciousness expressed by a word, is not a concept, because a concept is an act of mental discrimination that presupposes the possibility of affirmation and exclusion, and this awareness has no opposites. That sounds very complicated, but what he means there is this has to be true, because consciousness, to even imagine a world or imagine an external reality or imagine anything, there has to be a me, an I, an awareness of a self who even imagines anything to be. They said for there to be any concepts in action, there has to be an experiencer, a person underneath. And so for them, it can't be Yogacara, who was their big opponents were Yogacara Buddhism. But they said there has to be a self, and that self is responsible for all that exists. So what I'm going to do is kind of leave you with these debates, these questions, and these issues. Really, that debate went on and on and on between those three different groups. Yogacara became very popular, still is in certain countries. It's still dominant, very strong in China, amongst other things. Advaita, of course, became hugely influential, continuing major tradition in India. It did divide into many different schools. So that division of different views on the philosophical ideas continues. And Kashmiri Shaivism is still alive, although I think less so. Some of the older teachers, acharyas in the tradition, died out a few decades ago, so that people are very keen, I think, to sustain it, because actually, amongst other things, as well as being a powerful religious tradition, it's also philosophically just very, very interesting. So the three schools continue and the debate continues. What are the big debate issues that we can take from it? One, is the world real? Right? Is there external reality that relates to the world? Could all of this just be mind? Could it be the product of merely an illusory idea of the mind, as of a snake onto a rope? And thinking about what that superimposition, adhyasa in Sanskrit, would be, where I am just actually all there is pure awareness, no time, no space, no changes, no differences, just pure awareness. Could it be the case that I've accidentally imagined and imposed all of this onto the pure awareness? If I want to hold to that view, what causes that to happen? What shapes it? What means that my hand looks like this and is moving right now? What is it that's causally responsible for it? Where did even the idea of a world come from, if in reality there never has been a world? Right? Where, in a sense, did the template for my imagining arise? So that's number one. How would it work for the world to be purely an illusory phenomenon? Two, does there have to be a mind or a self for there to be experience? All of these idealisms think that the world is made out of, as it were, pure experience. But does experience need a mind? Does experience need a self, a person underneath it? Or could it just be a flow of experiences? And my feeling of being the person having them is purely an illusion. Right? So could my experience of being a mind be reduced to just some more ideas in a disembodied stream of experience? Further, is there any mind external real world out there? Could we ever know if there was? In fact, the very idea I have of a world outside my thought, is that even coherent? Because I'm always imagining myself perceiving an external world. So when I try and imagine something outside of thought, I imagine myself thinking, right? And that's often used to say that when we talk about there being a world outside, we don't even know what we mean. Further, if any of these idealisms are true, then, in a sense, how many minds are there? Me, you, the one mind that's dreaming it all? Are there other people out there beyond our experience? Idealism is often accused of giving rise to what's called solipsism, the idea that there's only me and no other people in reality. Right, but how would that work? So a lot of the concerns and debates were about if, for instance, there's only my one experience, do you really exist? What is it? If Shiva is dreaming all of this, is there only really Shiva? What's the relationship between my mind and yours, and why can't I see your thoughts? Right, so there are questions about how different minds work. Finally, and this comes up a bit in the Buddhist world as well, if idealism is true, what happens to ethics? If we're all just the dream of Shiva, or if we're all mere illusions, does it matter if I kick you in the shin and hurt you? And is your pain merely illusory? And does illusory pain matter? So all of this raises questions also about the ethics that comes from how we think about different beings existing. But finally, it's just kind of worth thinking about a lot of this. The goal of thinking about the world in terms of these idealisms was to remind us that ultimately we're already part of reality. We don't have to reach outside, as Descartes was worried about doing, to see if you could get hold of reality somewhere. It's already within. We only have to look within. And that's the kind of, in a sense, the phenomenological, inward assessing way of thinking. That's the gift that yoga traditions gave, that India was just much better at looking inside than almost every other global culture. So from the Vardhanya Upanishad, says there isn't a second reality here that he could perceive as something distinct and separate from himself. Already the person who understands this becomes the one ocean. He becomes the soul seer. And in the Chandogya Upanishad, as vast as this space here all around us is that space within the heart. Here, heart is almost a synonym for mind. And in it are contained both earth and sky, fire and wind, sun and moon, lightning and stars. Both what belongs to us, obviously, my thoughts, and also what does not, things that seem beyond me. All of it is contained in this self within. So in any case, what we do get in all of these idealisms is a sense that we already own or are part of the world. And the issue is really just to dig deeper inside and realize it. And that's from a beautiful image that I think was in the Smithsonian exhibition, where we see the yogi meditating, realizing the external world doesn't exist, realizing even he as an individual doesn't exist, and there is only the one ocean of consciousness left over. So those are my debate questions for you. I'm going to stop sharing screen now. There we go. And yeah, come back. Oh, I think we're on muted.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Well, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Fraser, for this beautiful comparison among the three very strong idealistic philosophical schools of India, each having its own version of idealism and each having its own defense of particular kind of idealism that they espouse. Wonderful. I mean, especially the 5 questions with which you have ended are really worth exploring. I mean, we should really, try to respond to these 5 questions from these three different perspectives. Can we take 1 or 2 questions from the participants if time permits?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Great, great. So, friends, Professor Fraser is in a hurry. She has to attend the meeting. So, if you have any questions or clarifications to ask, please come forward.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I am quite intrigued by your understanding of solipsism as a problem in idealistic school. So, in Indian schools of idealism, how they are tackling this problem? And in short, if you can.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, for Shankar, of course, this wasn't in a way a problem because he was very committed to the idea. For Advaita, there really is just one self. It's not even a self, it's consciousness. It's the one ocean. And I think he was very keen, almost as the motivation, is that if you realize that, there will only be one self. You no longer have to worry about other people because they don't exist. Having said that, I think he kind of accepted that part of the illusion is multiple selves. So that it still is the case that as soon as you're inside the avidya, the ignorance, or the maya, the illusory world, as soon as you're inside it, other people are real for you. And I really can't see inside your mind or you inside of mine. So in one sense, he embraced idealism. There is only one self. In other senses, he said, from within the illusory world, you are just as real as me. So that was Advaita's view. The Kashmiri Shaivas are quite fun. I had a student here in Oxford who did his philosophy dissertation on the problem of multiple minds in the Pratyabhijna tradition. And he said in the end, it's almost it sounds really weird, but it's almost as if the one consciousness of Shiva has multiple personality disorder, right? It's not a disorder, it's a willing thing. There's many internal consciousnesses, each with its own memory and story and personality within the one. That sounds negative, you think of it in a more positive way. It's like a great writer imagining multiple different characters. And each of those characters has its own awareness and patterns and doesn't know what the others think. And maybe that's the right analogy to use because the Pratyabhijna tradition was interested in art and literature and aesthetics, so that Shiva becomes like the ultimate novelist or playwright who generates multiple selves within himself. So that in a sense, both of those traditions say, yeah, there is only one self. But that self contains, or somehow in the worldly level, there are many selves within. So they kind of solved it by embracing both ends of the spectrum. Yogacara Buddhism was more complicated. They don't think any selves exist anyway. And each person is almost like a little pattern, like a ripple on the water of a river that's flowing. But the ripple isn't the same water anyway. The ripple is just a pattern of changing water. And that's all that we are. In a sense, we're separate. Ripples really are separate from each other, but none of them are ultimately real. So all of them said, ultimately, there is only one mind or no mind. But at the individual worldly level, selves really are separate from each other. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, of course. And one more short question for the Yogacara Buddhism position, isn't construction of any knowledge isn't a problem because there is no self. They are not admitting existence of any self. So construction from any knowledge, isn't it? Will not be a problem.
Well, it's complicated. I mean, of course, Yogacara. Yeah, it's a good question. It gets into complicated areas about what knowledge is. So in a sense, you're right. If knowledge is for me now, or I can take out me, if the mind function of analysis happening right now in a Jessica kind of way is seeing this pen over here, well, actually, no dharma, no basic qualia or perception moment really connects to anything else. I can't really see anything else. All of this is just flowing different moments of awareness. Nothing's connecting to anything. So Yogacara, you're right, kind of had trouble explaining the relationship of any moment of consciousness to any other moment of consciousness. Also, memory was a problem. How can I remember something in the past? So they had trouble with that in that way. And I think maybe that's why the most radical form of Buddhist skepticism, Madhyamika, said all knowledge is impossible. Yogacara tried to get around it, and they said, well, I mean, amongst other things, I know right now that experience is happening, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? Something's happening. But Madhyamika went further and said exactly as you just mentioned, there is no awareness, there is no thing, there's no perception, no concept, no self, no knowledge of anything at all is possible. And so you're absolutely right. If you take it to its most extreme degree, even knowledge cannot happen.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you for your kind response.
Anyone else? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, madam, yes, very interesting your deliberation. So, madam, what I have when it comes to my mind that your last slide actually giving us that a very one prominent line of our Upanishads that is Tattvam Asi, I am Brahman. So everything is consciousness. So everywhere is consciousness. Then, madam, my coming is that everything is consciousness. Then the lower category of things, then everything can be explained through consciousness. Then the lower non-living being. Then what about your position in this regard?
What about, sorry?
Non-living being.
Non-living being. Yeah, very good. Very good. Yeah, good. So, I mean, here you're right. For instance, you end up saying that the only thing in Advaita, so if you take Tattvamasi from Chandogya Upanishad chapter 6, and give it the Advaitic interpretation of it, and Shankara, the great Advaitin, commented on it, of course, then only things with consciousness are really real. And they're only real insofar as they have this consciousness. My memory, my personality, my habits, all of this is unreal. And actually, similarly, anything I've ever seen, like a stone, a tree, a landscape, all, as you say, the unconscious things, are also unreal. In a way, the only thing real is the raw light of awareness. But memory, thought, concepts, feelings, and anything we perceive, stones, trees, chairs, etc., all are kind of diminished in a way to the status of mere concepts, contents of consciousness, vikalpas, imaginings, or adhyasa, superimposed ideas, or kalpanas, again, kind of imagination things. And that means that, it's kind of, it becomes part of this lower level of reality. You know, Tatvamasi, you are, in the idealist way of thinking, consciousness, but you are not the stone, right? And I think, just as maybe a thing to end on, in this, Advaita is very different from the other forms of Vedanta. Mostly my work is on Vedābheda, which is sometimes seen to be the earliest form of Vedanta, which said, no, I really am one with the tree. I am one with the mountain. And Shankara says, you're not one with the tree. You're not one with the mountain. They are merely imagined concepts. So in that sense, the way in which these schools are Advaita, non-dual, the way in which they say you're one, is very different. And you're quite right. For Advaita, I'm not one with the physical, concrete world.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I guess, since she has to attend the meeting, I'm sorry that with that note, we have to end this lecture session. Once again, thank you very much, Professor Frazier, for being with us, for sharing your understanding of these three kinds of idealism in classical Indian philosophical systems. And, it is really very, very refreshing the way you portrayed the entire debate among these three kinds of idealism. Thank you very much, Professor Frazier, again.
Thank you very much to all of you. Nice to meet everyone, and thank you for your good and interesting questions as well. Have a lovely, I guess, evening there.
Yes. Thank you very much. Okay.
Bye-bye.